This is the Kodak 35 camera, and it was produced from 1938 to 1948. This camera is the predecessor to the Kodak 35 rangefinder, which I've discussed in a previous video. I've already expressed the fact that I think this is one of the homeliest/ugliest cameras to arrive on the market ever. And that's covering, I think, quite a long period of time. In any case, let's not talk about this camera. Let's get back to the Kodak 35. The Kodak 35 is a much more streamlined camera. This is scale focus, has no rangefinder, which means you're going to guess on the focus. And it was purely an amateur camera. Kodak's cameras really range from the very sophisticated and very elegant to very plain and very, I guess, very functional. This particular model was squarely aimed at the amateur market. However, there is something that I'll mention in a couple of minutes. This is a fixed lens camera and with a non-collapsible lens. This is primarily what you see is what you get. The Kodak 35 had 5 submodels with different lens and shutter combinations. This is the final camera. Beginning production in 1938, it did not have a coated lens, and as you can see, this lens is coated, and you can see the blue reflection. A blue or purplish reflection always indicates that the lens is coated. Some lenses have been coated after the fact, but I doubt you would do it with a modest, lower price camera. Okay, as I mentioned, there are 5 submodels, and so the earliest model looked similar to this, but of course had an uncoated lens. There was also a model that had black knobs, and then there were the 2 later models. Also, there was one other model that was olive drab with black knobs and a black viewfinder, and that was the military model. Those tend to cost more today when you see them on the used market. Of course, where else would you see them but on the used market? The earliest cameras had a Kodak anastigmat lens. The final models had a Kodak aniston. And at first I thought that that would be a 4-element tessar type. However, as it turns out, it really is just a 3-element triplet. In its history, Kodak branded quite a few lenses as an anastigmat, and some were 3-element lenses and some were 4-element lenses. In this case, this is a 3-element lens. From what I've read, the aniston is simply a renamed coated version of the 3-element anastigmat. So let's take a look at some of the particulars of this camera. So obviously you have your Kodak name, and then you have your shutter brand, which is the Kodak diamatic shutter. This had a limited range of speeds. It has 4 speeds, 150th, 150, 25, B, and T. You know, I think it probably would have been better to have a choice of, let's say, 200, 100, but because 150th to 100 really isn't that great of a jump. Apertures ran from f4.5 to f16. And this is a scale focus lens. So that meant you guessed on the focus. There's a little post here that stopped at infinity. And then you would simply guess on the distance to your subject. There's a small lever here. This lever is actually has to do with flash synchronization. You might think it's a shutter tensioning lever, but in fact it is not. Down here you have a flash synchronization post. And that would be for bulb flash, because at that time there was no electronic flash. They probably were working on it, but I don't think there were any commercially available. All right, on the top deck of the camera, there are several things going on. Obviously, you have your 2 knobs. This is your film advance. It shows you the direction that you should turn this knob. And also it says wind. This is your rewind knob. On the top of the rewind knob is a small scale, and that's simply a film minder scale to remind you what type of film you had loaded. Here's your rewind button, oddly placed very close to your film advance. This is your frame counter, manually set obviously. This is a small accessory shoe. I believe what you could do is you could purchase a separate rangefinder, slip it into the accessory shoe. This also would be if you had a flash unit, the bulb flash unit, you could slide that into there. Anyway, getting back to the rangefinder real quickly, it would just simply stand up like this, and then you could use that to focus on your subject. You'll notice a small wheel here. Well, first of all, let's talk about the viewfinder. This is a pop-up viewfinder and has 2 two lens elements, one in the front, one in the back. Aside from the branding, the camera branding, it just pops up. Fairly simple to use. Just lift the front of it, and the back of it is sprung and pops into place. And you can sort of see how those are lens elements rather than just plain glass. Let me close this so you can actually see this easier. This small wheel is used to correct for vertical parallax. Once you had set focus on the lens, you would then note the distance, and then you would dial that in here. And what that would do, it would slightly pivot the viewfinder either higher or lower to adjust for vertical parallax. It's actually a fairly complicated system for a fairly simple camera. It's interesting that they would put this on this camera because, you know, this is a very amateur level camera. The body itself is made of bakelite, and you'll notice it has this flattened oval shape. Very symmetrical. Here are your two strap lugs, and because the body is bakelite, occasionally you'll see chips here and here because these are the parts that protrude outward from the body. So if you're interested in purchasing this camera, keep that in mind. Also, you're going to notice how this isn't really strictly in line with the, it's slightly offset, right? It's not like directly perpendicular to, or strictly in line with the lens. And probably because this is slightly offset ever so slightly to the right. So Kodak corrected that by having this tilt ever so slightly to the right, or to the left, because this sits slightly to the right, so Kodak offset it by having it point ever so slightly toward the left. On the bottom of the camera, it's fairly simple. You just have your tripod socket, and of course, obviously not in alignment with the lens. This is an amateur camera, so that's not really a big deal. This is your back release. Very simple to use. So to open the back, you turn these little ears 1/4 turn. In this case, it's 1/4 turn to the right. If you notice, I've at first tried turning it to the left, and luckily it only goes one way, so you can't actually overturn it. So I just use my thumbs to push this away from the body, and then the back slides off. You'll notice a very highly reflective pressure plate and a small advertisement for Kodak film. Other camera makers did this, so this is not unusual. Here are two plastic frame rails that really just bakelite and I think sanded down to remove any type of burrs that might be on there or any type of lumps. Here's your sprocket wheel, and this is your take-up spool. Take-up spool has a slot here, and that's where you would insert the film leader into this slot. The pressure plate, in addition to being highly reflective, also is a fingerprint magnet. The pressure plate, of course, sits here against your film gate, your film rails, and of course the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against the film rails so that when you take a photograph, it will record as sharp an image as possible, edge to edge, corner to corner. Of course, getting a sharp photo is always dependent upon the lens being capable of taking a sharp photo. Not much else going on here. As I mentioned, this is all bakelite. Often you'll see little chips or breaks in the bakelite on the sides here. This one is a channel. This one also is a channel, but there's a raised edge right here, and it's not unusual to find a chip here on the corner. So to replace the back, simply place it on the back, push forward to the top of the camera, then take this and turn it 1/4 turn to the left. There's this little post right here, and that simply is to allow the camera to sit upright without it tilting forward. It's not a collapsible post, and it's probably not removable, or at least I don't think you should remove it. So real quickly, let's compare it side by side with the Kodak 35 rangefinder. You can see how the two cameras are built on the same shell. Built on the same basic shell, but the Kodak 35 has quite a bit else going on, and it has to do a lot, and it has to do with the rangefinder. It has this large top deck and housing for the rangefinder. It also has a lot of gearing and shrouds to cover the rangefinder mechanisms, and it has this big wheel up front. Certain things are similarly placed, such as your flash synchronization post. You also can see how the shutter is attached to the body in a very similar manner. Knobs are slightly similar, all these sit higher. Comparing them back to back, once again, you can see how they're built on the same shell and they have the same physical flattened oval shape, although this one does seem to be thicker, doesn't it? And it's probably thicker because it could be that this housing maybe flares out slightly away from the body. Let's take a look at the bottoms of the camera. And now you can see how these cameras really are identical. And that would make sense that they were built on the same body shelf from a production standpoint, because it would cost quite a bit of money to have to retool and build a body that was almost the same size but slightly different. This way, both cameras could be made on the same production line with with a couple of final changes to account for the rangefinder assembly. So when you load film in the camera, let's pop this off again real quick. When you load film in the camera, what it does is the film is dragged across these sprocket rules, obviously, and moves the sprocket wheels. The rotation of the sprocket assembly here also tensions the shutter. There's no external means to tension the shutter. There's no external lever or anything like that. And so that means at a certain point, this becomes very stiff and very difficult to move. I've always been surprised that it doesn't tear into the film just because of the amount of effort involved in tensioning the shutter. This is your shutter release. It's just this little tiny pin extending toward the body. And so when you release the shutter, you simply press down, and that's it. It's a very quiet shutter. Remember, there's no such thing as a silent shutter, because a silent shutter would mean the absence of sound. So you can just say it's quiet or not so quiet. In this case, it is a quiet shutter, but that's not a surprise because most leaf shutters are quiet shutters when they're released. This is a somewhat lightweight camera, so let's take a look and see what it weighs. Okay, the Kodak 35 comes in at 1 pound, 3.5 ounces. Pretty squarely in the middle between 1 pound 3 and 1 pound 4 ounces. And it's a larger sibling. Kodak 35mm rangefinder weighs 1 pound, 8.2 ounces, meaning that the Kodak 35 is 4.7 ounces heavier, or almost 5 ounces heavier. And you would expect that because of all the additional gearing and other items that make up your rangefinder. The Kodak 35, as I mentioned, was introduced in 1938, while the Kodak 35 rangefinder was introduced in 1940, and its production run continued until 1951, 3 years after the end of production of the Kodak 35. So years ago, I had an opportunity to take this camera out and give it a try, and I had mixed results. One of the problems I had was this requires such light pressure to trip the shutter that a number of times I accidentally released the shutter. I would just say that the pressure required to trip the shutter is far too light. I also found the performance of this triplet lens, the Aniston, to be unremarkable. It was good at small apertures, at larger apertures. Its performance, I think, and at various different distances, I think its performance was uneven at best. I didn't like the fact that the top shutter speed was only 1/150th. As I mentioned, I think it would have been much better if the top shutter speed had been 1/200th of a second. However, not much you can do about that these days. With that in mind, I used a 100 speed film. This would give me enough flexibility when shooting in daylight to be able to use different apertures, and that was probably the best option. Remember, at that time, I don't believe there was any Tri-X, any 400 speed films. Probably I think film speeds topped out at roughly, what, 200? I think there was Kodak Double X. I like the handling of the camera. I think the body shape is nice. This flattened oval, that's how I often describe this. And I think it feels good in the hands. It's not a huge camera, and it feels just about right. The front-mounted shutter releases are an acquired taste, but it's something that you have to try yourself and get used to. Advancing the film definitely gave me some concerns at times that I was going to tear those sprocket holes in the film, but in fact that never happened. Overall, I had fun using this camera. I wouldn't say that it was a stellar camera. It was an adequate camera. My final rating for this camera is 8.5. Where it scored low was in the lens and choice of materials. But I probably would say that about most cameras that have bakelite bodies. The bakelite tends to get very brittle over years, and often, like as I mentioned, you'll see damaged bodies, usually here or here, or in the film chamber, some damage to the back or such. If you're planning to buy a Kodak 35, just inspect it as carefully as you can. There are plenty of these cameras still on the market. There's no reason to purchase the damaged camera. If you have an opportunity, I'd probably purchase the version with a coated lens. This camera's earlier uncoated anastigmat and later coated aniston are essentially the same 3-element lens design. You might as well purchase the one with a coated lens. In addition to giving you better contrast, it should also offer more resistance to those fine scratches that occur when somebody overcleans the lens. One thing I will say about this particular lens is the front element is deeply inset. That kept it away from being brushed up against clothing and hopefully from people trying to overclean the lens. And that's my take on the Kodak 35 camera. A nice little camera with a 10-year production run. Still usable today, although wouldn't be my first choice for photography. Which brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, think about giving me a like and subscribe. If you'd like to leave a comment, please do so below, or you can send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And don't forget to click on that icon down here to see more videos about cameras and photography. And see you on the next video.